Hello and welcome to Democracy and Dictatorship, a show where we explore nuances of human interactions and how they impact the world's societies, politics and economies. Each week, we hope to examine the elements which hold together ideas and concepts of power, elements which are constantly under threat. From history to the present day, the relationships of the governing with the governed is really fascinating. We need to learn from that so that together we figure the best way forward. On today's episode, we are going to take a look at refugee communities and the movement of displaced people in the hope of asylum. There's been an explosion in news coverage on this topic. Thanks to the press and social media, refugee stories have become a big part of our everyday. You hear about clashes of culture, but also happy stories of integration. All of this has gotten us thinking what the refugee experience truly is like. What does it mean to be reduced to labels like migrant, foreigner, and refugee, where your statehood itself is being questioned? We would like to draw your focus now to South Asia, specifically to the ongoing situation in Rakhine State in Myanmar. What's happening there is definitely a cause for concern. In India alone, there are more than 30,000 Rohingya refugees. WION visited one of their camps in Delhi and documented the harsh reality these refugees are forced to live with.
India is home to over 35,000 Rohingya refugees. These stateless people are from the Rakhine province in Myanmar.
पच्चीस साल से शांति क्या चीज़ है हमें मालूम नहीं है। शांति ये देखा नहीं हमने। रात को आया था 3-4 मिलिट्री आगे हमारे पूरे घर चेक करके हम लोग को मिला नहीं। हम मेरे चाचा घर था बगल में, वो चाचा का घर पे घुस के मेरी जो चाची की बहन है वो उसको बलात्कार वहाँ रेप करके चला गया। तो जब सुबह जाके मेरे चाचा ने वहाँ मिलिट्री कैंप पे जाके वो कंप्लेन किया था, तो वहाँ चाचा को इतना मारा वहाँ से घर आके वो इंतकाल हो गया।
मेरे सामने तो बहुत आदमी मार दिए, मौलाना मार दिए, मुझे खुद मालूम है। ये गांव जला रहे हमारे बर्मा में, पेट्रोल मार के जला रहे गांव।
जब वहाँ पर पढ़ता था वहाँ पर तो टीचर वहाँ के हैं बुद्धिस्ट, उनके पास पेन नहीं होता तो हमसे मांगने के लिए कहता तो उन्होंने कहता कि इस जानवर से मत लिया करो, हमसे कहते थे जानवर।
मारो मेरे दादा को ऊपर दाढ़ी काट दी, दाढ़ी गर्म पानी डालो मेरे दादा को ऊपर, अपनी दादा को ऊपर गर्म पानी डालो जब मेरे चाची का ब्याह हो।
सुंदर लड़की जहाँ जिसकी घर पे ज़्यादा है, 18 साल बा 15 साल लड़की जो है उसको पकड़ के ले जाते हैं, 18 साल का लड़का को ले जाते हैं, वापस आते नहीं यार।
Treated as undocumented migrants in their own country, they have been refused citizenship by Myanmar. For decades, successive governments have denied these homeless families their basic right. Around 140,000 Rohingyas were displaced after a Buddhist woman was raped in 2012. This led to rampant sectarian violence in the country. Thousands of them had to be moved to neighboring countries.
2012 में जब रॉयट्स हुआ बर्मा में, तब बर्मा से बहुत सारे लोग बांग्लादेश में आ रहे थे, तो कुछ बोट को उन लोगों ने पुश बैक भी किया। ऐसे जिस बोट को पुश बैक किया वो बैग उधर भी जा नहीं पा रहे क्योंकि वहाँ से भी गन लेके खड़े हैं वहाँ का फोर्स। फिर 3 बोट वहाँ रिवर में नाफ रिवर में अंदर चला गया, तो उसमें बहुत सारे बच्चे औरत मारा गया है।
कश्ती में दो ढाई घंटा तक गया हम, फिर पैदल चला पूरे दिन चला, 26 घंटा तो रात दिन चला पैदल। वैसे आया भूखे प्याज, हम खा लो कहाँ मिल रहा हमारे पहाड़ में।
वहाँ पे तो काम ज़्यादा यही करता, रात को काम करता ना, तो लेडीज़ को ले जाता उठाकर, फिर 2 घंटा 3 घंटा के बाद फिर लेकर आता। डर तो लगता है, बहुत आदमी जेल में है अभी भी हमारे, वहाँ से आते पकड़ा गया था इस बार। अभी जेल में बहुत लोग हैं वहाँ।
It was only in the year of 2015 that the world acknowledged the deprived state of the Rohingya refugees. About 200 displaced families take refuge in this Rohingya camp in New Delhi.
लोग बोलते हैं भाई तुम कैसे आ गया इधर, देश से कैसे निकला, लेकिन ये कोई नहीं पूछता है कि तुमको क्यों निकलना पड़ा। अभी देखिए वो जो सीरिया में हो रहा है, अफगानिस्तान पे हो रहा है, इराक पे हो रहा है और जो बर्मा में हो रहा है, इसमें एक डिफरेंस है, ये स्लो जेनोसाइड है।
पहले 2012 के आगे बिल्कुल मतलब बहुत हमदर्दी था। हम तो घर खाते, एक दिन बुद्धिस्ट का घर में खाते हैं, दूसरा दिन हिंदू का घर में खाते हैं, वो हमारे घर में खाते हैं, ऐसा ही है, सब मिल जुल के।
इस टाइम मेरे बर्मा सुई हो जाएगी ना, इस तंजाई में चल जाएंगे। सुई नहीं होगा तो यहाँ मर जाएंगे, लेकिन नहीं जाएंगे।
If you are Indian, if you are recognized as a refugee in a place which is your country, so what do you feel?
बर्मा कह रहा है कि आप माइग्रेंट है, बांग्लादेश कह रहे हैं कि आप लोग हमारे नहीं हैं, इंडिया कह रहे हैं कि आप फॉरेनर हैं, यूनिसेफ कह रहे हैं आप रेफ्यूजी हैं, पूरा दुनिया कह रहा है आप स्टेटलेस हैं।
For decades, the Rohingya people have lived in a state of uncertainty in search for an identity. They form the largest group of displaced people in South Asia. Yet their plight found no mention in the meetings between the Indian and Myanmar's leadership on August 29th. Their hopes now hinge on the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State constituted by the Myanmar government. The commission will deliver its report in August next year. It is widely expected to call on the government to offer the Rohingya people a path to citizenship. But it remains to be seen whether Myanmar's first democratically elected government can tame the hardliners and travel down that route. With Nagain Singh, this is Manoj Kevalramani, WION.
It's terrible that the Rohingyas are made to feel like they don't belong. But on the other side of that coin, you have refugees who have built a life for themselves in a new country and then are asked to leave. More on that when we return after a short break. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship, where we are trying to understand this huge refugee crisis that's plaguing the world. Before the break, we were talking about people who are being thrown back and forth between countries. That's exactly what's happening in Pakistan right now. The government is asking Afghan refugees to go back to their country. Taha Siddiqui, our correspondent in Pakistan, met with an Afghan family who is being repatriated. Here's what they had to say about their experience of living a role of a refugee in Pakistan.
In this Afghan refugee settlement outside Peshawar city, many houses lay vacant. One such house is of Jannat Gul's uncle, who moved here with his family after the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s. The family recently repatriated to Afghanistan. Before they left, they demolished the mud house they built to salvage construction material. Jannat has fond memories of growing up here.
देश काले तेर कड़ा वो दोनों खुशहालियाँ नहीं बस आगुई लाड़ अख्तर न पस पर मुंगम जू दिल ता दमा मामा दज़वी वादो देर ज़्यादा खुशहालो.
Like Jannat, many of his Afghan neighbors have also decided to leave. Jan Gul, his father, and his uncle are tired of being harassed by the Pakistani police. Such crackdowns have intensified recently as Pakistani government announced that it will not host Afghan refugees beyond 2016.
कार्ड है हमारा पास माला सारा कार्ड स्टा खपला कार्ड स्टा चे आलता मुंग पुलिसुनी सी नो मंग ना पैसे माली.
Officially, Jan and his family can stay in Pakistan till the end of the year. His father has even opposed their return to Afghanistan, but the family knows they have no choice.
हमारा तो दिल नहीं जो जाओ मड़ी थी तो खुश है 40 साल भुगता है घर भी है जा भी है सब चीज़ है
To return to Afghanistan, registered refugees have to apply to a United Nations repatriation center located nearby. Thousands of Afghan refugee families have flocked here and camped outside this UN repatriation center, the only one in the country. Many of the families I spoke to here say that they've been waiting for days to get inside the center. The UN officials here say that they're processing 500 cases every day, but despite that, the crowd here keeps getting larger. Anullah and his family have waited for 3 days for their turn to come. Their case will be processed today, and the family plans to immediately leave for their war-torn homeland.
बस डर भी लगते हैं नहीं भी लगते हैं इधर ये हालात है तो अपना मुल्क है उधर अगर फौज भी हो गया तो मुल्क तो अपना है.
The UN officials managing this center acknowledge that they're overwhelmed with the outflow of refugees, but they're planning to make necessary arrangements.
We have extended the hours and dates of our VRC, the center, and we are working on establishing another voluntary repatriation center in Nowshera to handle and to mainstream, to streamline this crowd.
Pakistan hosts 1.5 million Afghans, the world's second largest refugee population in a single country. In addition, 1 million undocumented Afghans also live in Pakistan. Human rights observers have urged Pakistani authorities to reconsider and review their discriminatory policy towards the refugees and abide by its international commitments.
Whether it's South Asia or Africa or Europe, this feeling of statelessness is experienced by so many refugees across the globe. In Europe, a massive influx of Syrian refugees has brought the ugly face of clashing cultures to the fore. Germany is one such country, where confrontations between ethnic residents and refugee communities have taken a violent turn. Here's that report by Aisha Sindhu.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel and her party are considering banning the full-face veil in public places. The decision follows a spay tax in the country. In July, an 18-year-old gunman opened fire on a mall in Munich, killing at least 9 people. The German-Iranian perpetrator killed himself later. However, police said there was no evidence to indicate that this was a terrorist attack. The Munich attack was not the only one to hit Germany. Just a few days earlier, an axe-wielding 17-year-old asylum seeker killed 5 people on a train. An incident that was claimed by the Islamic State.
Wir alle wissen, dass Deutschland bereits seit langem im Fadenkreuz des Terrors steht. Und wir alle wissen auch, dass durch die hervorragende Arbeit der Innenbehörden, insbesondere auch der Polizei und all derer, die mit ihr zusammen.
Recent terror strikes in Nice in France and Brussels in Belgium suggest that Germany has reason to be concerned about the specter of Islamic terror. Unfortunately, stories of kindness and successful integration don't always make news. For instance, the story of the 20-year-old Afghan guard who ushered 200 people to safety in the basement of the mall in Munich went largely unreported. There is a tenuous calm functioning in Germany as a result. Till such time integration processes are not ironed out, clashes of culture seem all too imminent. Aisha Sindhu, WION.
What can be done to help refugees integrate easily into a new country? It's a tough question, but we need to try and answer it. We're going to take a break right now, but when we return, we have with us in the studio Pierre Cranbiol, Commissioner General for the UN Relief and Works Agency for the Palestine refugees in the Near East, and R. Dayakar, former Indian ambassador to Jordan and Iraq. And we're going to discuss refugee integration, what to expect in the future. Stay with us. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. Before the break, we looked at stories of refugees from Myanmar, Pakistan, and the situation in Germany. Joining us now is Pierre Cranbiol, Commissioner General for the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. Pierre has more than 25 years of experience in humanitarian and development works across the globe. Also joining us is R. Dayakar, a former Indian ambassador. In his 34 years of service, he's been posted on diplomatic missions to Iraq, Vietnam, Jordan, just to name a few. Thank you both for joining us. Let's start by talking about how do we better integrate these refugees. Pierre, do you want to take up?
Well, fundamentally, the first thing to remember is that one has never met, I have never met in 25 years, refugees who want to be refugees. That's the first thing. I don't think anybody who has become a refugee wishes to remain a refugee. And certainly for the Palestine refugee community that UNRWA serves and represents, there's a very clear sense historically that they wanted a just and lasting solution to their political plight.
Mr. Dayakar, to bring you in on this, there are many refugees who come and set up home in the countries that are hosting them. And after living there for decades, don't want to go back home because this is their new home. How does one address that?
Actually, there are different stories for behind different refugee influx. India has been a home since independence for refugees from various countries. 47 was the beginning, then 58 we had Tibetan refugees, and later on from Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and so on. So each one has its own compulsion behind that, and it has to be addressed accordingly. For instance, Sri Lankan refugees went back. Quite a lot of them, they were camping. But Tibetan refugees, it seems to be open-ended. In fact, Supreme Court has instructed the government of India that they are entitled for citizenship, those who are born in India. India has a policy which is a little nebulous. It's not a clear-cut policy, but whoever can come in and stay on and find their own destiny with the help of UNHCR.
But India is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. Why is that?
Actually, there is no clear-cut policy statement by the government of India, but a construction can be made out of a series of circumstances. I think there is a certain political dimension to the work of UNHCR. India had some unfortunate experiences in 1971, and also there is implication to sovereignty also, because when you signatory to UNHCR, beyond your humanitarian work, you are also obliged to follow certain guidelines and restrictions of UNHCR. So I think a combination of these things has made India not to be a formal signatory to it, but it did not prevent India. In fact, India's record on humanitarian work is quite exemplary.
Children living in these makeshift camps, they almost don't have a childhood. What can be done to, return their childhood to them in many ways?
Every boy and girl has their own expectation in life, the hope to participate, to give meaning to their lives. And yet the circumstances are very adverse, very many pressures and challenges that they have to face. One thing that we have found absolutely essential is to invest in education. Our organization runs, for example, 700 schools for 500,000 boys and girls. And what I saw when I joined UNRWA 2.5 years ago is that this investment in education means that you don't look at the person only from the hopelessness. You look at the person from the actor of his or her own destiny, able to pick up things despite the adversity and invest maybe in a better future.
What do you think of developing countries like India, who are non-signatories to the Refugee Convention? Do you think there is value to that?
Well, the first thing I think it's at the end of the day a sovereign choice for every country to make. But what I've seen in the meetings I had here in Delhi and the importance of engaging the Indian government on issues related to, in this particular mandate that I now represent with Palestine refugees, there's been a historic, very strong sense of solidarity with the issue of Palestine, with Palestine refugees. India also supports UNRWA's work, and we're trying to find ways to expand on that partnership. So I found in my meetings at the Ministry of External Affairs with the Minister of State, but also with Secretary West, a lot of interest, a keen desire to support our work. And I think it's very important to hear India's voice and to have India's experience represented, certainly in the discussions with our organization.
During the meet with the Myanmarese Prime Minister, the Indian Prime Minister did not bring up the Rohingyas. Was there a specific reason, you think, that it wasn't brought up?
frankly, it's not a core issue between the two countries, and it's not a big burden on India, either economically, socially, or politically. It's a small number of people, considering the overall 250,000 refugees India is hosting for decades. So it did not get the real attention with the president of the Myanmar when he was here. And I'm not surprised with that. Not surprised.
The 2016 General Assembly is going to certainly be taking up the issue of Syria in a big way, and the refugees specifically, including many world leaders, including Obama and the Canadian Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister possibly. What do you make of it? How can we go towards resolving the Syrian refugee issue?
For the stability in West Asia, for the ability to gradually resolve the circumstances, political action is needed. And I would say if the summits that are going to take place in New York are going to focus only on providing more humanitarian aid, which I should be advocating for because that is the work that we do and it is important, but it is not what resolves these issues. We cannot just continue for decades to provide more aid. It is time for the international community to invest in a revival of political action.
88,000 refugees have fled Sudan, South Sudan, in the last few months, since July. What can be done in these countries? Is there a more larger global action required to be able to stop such a refugee crisis from happening?
I think whenever there is a peak moment, like the urgent, sometimes forced, sometimes necessary displacement, families choose to flee a conflict zone, and that happens in conflicts around the world. The first response is, of course, a humanitarian response. It's a protection response to ensure that people who are forced to flee their homes can find temporary shelter somewhere and not be attacked by armed groups and others. So this is the emergency phase. But what we often see is that the emergency turns into the protracted. So you move from the acute to the chronic situation. And this is again very evident in the Afghan example. It's evident in the Somali example. Somali refugees in Kenya, for example, for many, many years now. And it's clearly the case for Palestine refugees. And so it keeps bringing us back to, if we want the world to stabilize, we have to have a culture that comes back in the international community to not do conflict management. That's a word we've heard too much of over the last 20 years. We manage conflicts. You can manage conflicts for a century if you want. The question is whether you can act to resolve them. And I think it is interesting to see that in the rebalancing that we're seeing in the international political system, that actors like India, countries like India with their very specific outlook, can be new contributors to ways to bring about political solutions in the world, which is so much called for. And I always say, we can close our eyes now on the problems of West Asia, on the problems of Israel and Palestine, but when we open them in 5 years and in 10 years, things will not be better. So it is time to act now.
Absolutely. And I think looking at the way refugees are now in many, many parts of the world, we'll have to find solutions back for where they belong, and we have to kind of clamp down on these conflicts in some ways. And I think the world community has to play a role. Thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Mr. Deyako, for joining us. At WION, we believe the world is one large family, which is why these stories matter to us. Thank you for joining us on Democracy and Dictatorship. Watch out for our show next week as we continue to try and understand the world around us, the good, the bad, and everything in between, because nothing is absolute. Thank you.